What's going on, guys? Doomwake here, and welcome back to week number 2 of the Pioneer metagame. First and foremost, if this is your first time here, we did a first episode last week. If you want to go ahead and check that out, we will leave a link in the description down below. And if this is your first time here on this particular episode, welcome. We are going to take a look at the Pioneer metagame as it shapes and forms up until the regional championship, which is only a couple of weeks away at this point. Before we continue, if you enjoy this style of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help out the channel. Like the video, and most importantly, let me know what you thought down below in the comments section. If you enjoy this type of content, I'm gonna, for now, up until the regional championship, we're gonna make this a reoccurring thing, but I'd love to hear your feedback on this, because there's certainly ways that we can improve on this particular segment. Maybe we'll make a series out of it. We can switch formats from week to week, but I do think that keeping an eye on the metagame for whatever relevant format is current at the time does make a lot of sense, because I know you guys are invested in the competitive landscape. With all of that out of the way, we have 5 challenges for you today. There's 4 in the weekend, and then I snagged 1 on Friday. So we're going to go in sequential order. So the first one we have here, I'm going to put up the data for the Friday challenge. So this is how the top 32 breakdown looks like. Remember, we're looking at top 32s because those are the deck lists that we have available. I don't think there's any way to get the data for the entire challenge. If there was, probably would take a while to gather that data and mine that sort of data. But in any case, let's look at the top 32. So you'll notice this one is a little more Phoenix heavy, which is a little surprising. If you were with us last week, you recall the rise in popularity of that Rakdos Prowess deck. And it's still here. It's the second most played deck of the top 32. But it's starting to flatten out a little bit. If you remember last week, there was some challenges that had 9 or 10 copies. I think there was one challenge where it was 9 copies and the next highest deck was maybe like 3 or 4. So it was really, really dominant. And I think as people start to adapt and figure out how to beat this deck, they realize it's not that hard to beat it. You just play some removal spells, maybe some exile-based removal, more temporary lockdowns, more sweepers, portable holes, stuff like that. So it's really easy to beat this deck, and I think people are finally realizing that. Izzet Phoenix is the top dog again, which for people who have been playing Pioneer for about 3 years, you're probably not surprised to see that. Rakdos Prowess in second, and then it's really after those two, like neck and neck, it's really just a bunch of 2 and 1-ofs. So you see Jund Sacrifice, Azorius Control, the Yorion Loomer deck that was pretty cool, Rakdos Transmogrify. We'll put a sample list of it on screen here for those of you who may not have seen this deck before, but it's really just Transmogrify into Atraxa, utilizing token makers like Stash Skeleton and Fable the Mirror Breaker. A lot of cool stuff going on. Boros Control, which was popularized by Oaf McNamara. Shout out to Oaf McNamara. Celestia Angels, and then a smattering of 1-ofs here. You can kind of see the breakdown there, but nothing too fancy. There's no sort of new decks in this field. It's really just the continuance of trying to figure out, it's the neck and neck race between Phoenix and Rakdos Prowess. Spoiler alert, I think Phoenix probably comes out on top most of the time. But yeah, there's nothing too crazy going on, but this is kind of that evolution of the metagame we talked about last week. Like I said, Rakdos Prowess for the previous 2 weeks have just been absolutely everywhere, crushing every single tournament. And I essentially said it last week, this week was going to be the week that people started to try to beat it. And when we take a look at the next one, people certainly did successfully, not just try, they did successfully beat it. So, the first challenge on the 14th, which was Saturday, this breakdown is pretty telling here. 7 copies of Jund Sacrifice, 4 Celestia Angel, 4 Azorius Control. That's almost half of the top 32 that I think has an 80-20 matchup against that Rakdos Prowess deck. The Rakdos deck does have plenty of horrendous matchups, and I think all 3 of these would be included in that category. Jund Sacrifice has plenty of ways to just kill small creatures, like Fatal Push, Claim the Firstborn. Angels just gains way too much life. Like, the Rakdos Prowess deck can deal, I would say, safely, like, somewhere between 25 to 30 damage on average, but once you get past that and the Angels deck starts gaining a bunch of life, it's pretty difficult. And then Azorius Control, bunch of cheap removal, temporary lockdowns, good recipe. And then you see the Rakdos Prowess and Atarka Red kind of neck and neck at 3 copies apiece. Atarka Red making a bit of a resurgence here, which is a little surprising. I would think that because of how popular the Rakdos Prowess deck was over the past couple of weeks, the people who were previously playing Atarka Red would just swap to the Rakdos version. But maybe it's a case of they like the green cards, like Blossoming Defense, Snakeskin Veil. Because the big difference between Rakdos and Gruul is the protection spells that Gruul offers you. Like I said, Snakeskin Veil, Blossoming Defense. So you can kind of shove on a big creature and not feel so bad about it. And that's the reason I don't like the Rakdos deck, is because it doesn't really have a way to protect anything. And Gruul sort of fixes that problem. A little bit of Lumra, a little bit of Spirits, and then a smattering of one-ups. One thing I will mention about this challenge, you see that one copy of Izzet Phoenix compared to the 6 that we saw in the last challenge. So Phoenix kind of ebbs and flows, and I don't necessarily know if it's a product of the Phoenix players were just sleeping during this challenge, and maybe they're in different time zones. But yeah, just something to keep an eye on, but nothing too fancy at the rest of those. And now we get into the Sunday challenges. Now, I was going through Fireshoes' Twitter, and Fireshoes had 3 challenges listed on Sunday, but only 1 on Saturday. I don't know if that was a typo, or I don't actually know if there's 3 challenges on Sunday, because it seems kind of weird, but maybe there is. And in any case, this is the first one of those from Sunday. Now, this one is maybe more what we were used to if you watched last week's episode. 8 copies of Rakdos Prowess, and then the next most played deck is 3. It's basically what I said earlier. Now, as far as the decks below this, Jund Sacrifice, I want to highlight 3 copies of Lotus Field combo, because we haven't really seen any Lotus Field. Now, 3 in the top 32, it's a pretty small number, but, I mean, it is technically tied for second place compared to the other numbers here. Just a little bit of a resurgence, which I think makes sense. Well, it makes sense, but it also doesn't at the same time, where I think Lotus Field is a huge dog to the Rakdos aggro deck. They don't have a ton of interaction. They just let the Rakdos deck goldfish, and if the Rakdos deck is allowed to goldfish on you, it's probably going to kill you on turn 3. But Lotus Field is very good against Phoenix, so if we go back to the first challenge, the one that was Phoenix heavy, you sort of see how the metagame kind of adapts from challenge to challenge, where Phoenix heavy, next one, a little bit less Phoenix, but then maybe this one was more looking at the metagame from the first challenge, and then more people decided to play Lotus, so on and so forth. Rakdos Midrange, Monogreen Devotion, Azorius Control, and then Izzet Phoenix, all at 2 copies apiece. And then in these one-ofs, oh boy, do we have a deck to highlight for you today. I have it listed on here as Planeswalker Control, because I don't really know how else to describe this deck. We're going to put the deck list up on screen for you, but take a look at this absolute heater of a deck. Incubation Druid, Llanowar Elves, and Sylvan Caryatid for some mana acceleration. Mila, Crafty Companion. I actually had to pull this one up. This, I think we're mostly casting this for the Luca backside, so it might as well be a Planeswalker. And then Innkeeper's Talent and Oath of Nissa. Now, Innkeeper's Talent is very, very important in this deck, because the way that Innkeeper's Talent is worded, if you go to level 3, it says, if you would put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters. So every single Planeswalker you cast when you have this fully leveled enters with double loyalty, which means that most of them you can immediately ultimate. And then from here, you can see we just have a smattering of Planeswalkers. Chandra, Torch of Defiance, Kaya the Inexorable, Nicol Bolas, the Dragon God, Ral Zarek, Tamiyo, Field Researcher, Eternal Wanderer, Wandering Emperor, Vraska, Betrayal Sting, Ren, and Realmbreaker. And then Interplanar Beacon, kind of some more Planeswalker-focused synergy within the mana base itself. I may have to try this deck out for myself. It looks really, really sweet. Picked up a top 32 in the hands of TNTMTHOS. Big shout out to them. Yeah, just wanted to highlight that one real quick, because it looked pretty sweet, even though probably wouldn't necessarily recommend bringing it to the RC, but it's probably good for leagues and challenges at least. All right, so we have 2 more challenges to go over here on Sunday the 15th. The first one we are going to start with, this one's pretty even at the top. So 5 copies of Phoenix, 5 copies of Prowess. It's not quite as dominant by one or the other. It's kind of going back to that first challenge where it was a little more neck and neck. Jund Sacrifice, Celestia Company, Rakdos Midrange. Again, 3 decks that I think all have reasonable matchups against the Prowess deck, so it makes sense to see these rising to the top. Angels, Lumra, Spirits, Control, and then only a couple one-ofs, Greasefang, and you'll notice down here we have a single copy of Esper Control in addition to the 2 copies of Azorius Control. The Esper Control deck, we'll highlight this one real quick. This one actually came in 5th place, so did pick up a top 8 in the hands of user Ken-Chan, and this deck list looks pretty similar to most blue-white decks, but you'll notice the black splash here is for a Cling to Dust, 4 copies of Fatal Push, 2 copies of Vanishing Verse, and a Pest Control. And then going into the sideboard, we have a couple of Cutdowns, a single Thoughtseize, and a couple of Kalidas, Trader of Get. cut down just more cheap removal against the Rakdos decks. Does make a lot of sense. Pest Control, sort of the same thing. And then Cling to Dust helps a little bit against Phoenix. Vanishing Verse, Exile removal, very, very important right now. That's one thing I want to stress about the metagame in general. If you're playing a color that has access to removal that exiles, it's a really good time to be playing that. Torch the Tower, Portable Hole, Vanishing Verse, as we see here, Leyline Binding, that kind of stuff, because both Izzet Phoenix and Heartfire Hero, those are two of the most played creatures in the format, and both of those have, well, Phoenix doesn't have a die trigger, but it comes back, and then Hero has the dice trigger, so exile removal, very good right now. But as far as the rest of this top 32, sort of business as usual. There's a little bit of spice here in the form of Izzet and Soul, something we really haven't seen that much, but for the most part, it's like a little bit more balanced, not as much towards the very top end, but a good smattering of decks that you would probably expect here. But again, it's continuing that trend of decks that are good against the Rakdos Prowess deck, more rising to the top, like your Phoenixes, Jund Sacrifices, Celestia Companies, Rakdos Midrange. And then the last challenge on Sunday here, there's 7 Prowess and 6 Phoenix compared to the 5 and 5 from the previous one, so numbers up a little bit. It's slightly in favor of Rakdos Prowess, but it really is still neck and neck between these two decks. 5 Celestia Angels, 3 Azorius Control, 2 Jund Sac, 2 Mono Black Waste Not, maybe something we have not seen as much recently, and then just a couple of one-ofs, the Transmogrify, a Tarka Red, Lotus Field combo, so on and so forth. So, now, the big question is, what do all of this mean? So I'm going to take a look at this metagame as a whole. So between these 5 challenges, the most played decks were Izzet Phoenix, Rakdos Prowess, and Jund Sacrifice. So, for the most part, it does seem that the metagame is really kind of jockeying for position back and forth between Phoenix and Rakdos Prowess. So if you are playing or considering playing and doing a lot of testing for the regional championship in DC, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, my recommendation, now you're going to ask me in the comments what's the answer to this question. I'm suggesting this because I don't have an answer yet. Maybe I will in a couple of weeks, who knows. If you can find a deck that has a good matchup, which I consider anything over 50-50 good, because it's really hard to get to certain like higher percentage points than that. If you can find a deck that is reasonable against both Rakdos Prowess and Izzet Phoenix, I think you're in a pretty good spot. Now, one thing that's very interesting to me, and I was thinking about over the past couple of weeks, and let me know in the comments section down below what you guys think of this. How much of this Rakdos Prowess deck is even going to be at the regional championship? I don't know if this is a flash in the pan. I don't know if this is a Magic Online exclusive where people are less likely to play it in paper. They're only playing it on Magic Online because it's fast, it's easy to double queue with, things like that. But my personal experience with the Rakdos Prowess deck has been mostly negative. I've been really struggling against decks that have heavy removal spells. Like I said, your Rakdos Midranges, Izzet Phoenixes, Blue-White Control, things like that. Those matchups are kind of a slog, and it's really hard to win because not only do you have lower card quality on average, like you're playing Titan Strength and a lot of pump spells, and you can't really ever play any semblance of a long game with the Rakdos deck, you don't have any protection. The biggest thing going for Boros Heroic and the Atarka Red decks that we saw pop up in one of the challenges, the one that had 3 copies, those decks have protection. Blossoming Defense, Snakeskin Veil, God's Willing, Crumb and Get It now in the Boros Heroic deck. They have ways to protect the shove turn, right? The turn that they're casting all these pump spells and the double strike stuff, they can respond to a removal spell with effectively a counter spell. And the Rakdos deck doesn't have those. So I wonder if maybe there's a way to incorporate a third color into the Rakdos decks, either for Blossoming Defense or Crumb and Get It or God's Willing, some sort of protection spell, sacrifice a little bit of the utility lands, just play more dual lands. You probably wouldn't be able to play basics at that point, but that's at least an avenue that I want to consider exploring. Past that, I mean, a lot of my testing is going to be focusing on just really tuning and testing the Phoenix list for the next couple of weeks. I'm going to be spending a lot of time on that because I do fully expect to be playing Phoenix. Now, again, we do have a whole new set coming out, and with the early access events on Magic Online and potentially Arena, I'm going to see if I can maybe get in on the Arena early access stuff. I Will try my best. I'll see if there's anything that's worth considering in the new set for Pioneer. As of right now, there's not a ton that I have my eyes on. A couple of cards, but as far as is anything going to shake up the metagame is anything really going to shake up the metagame? That's a hard question to answer. I think we've sort of covered most of the things that I wanted to in terms of where the metagame is shifting. I guess one final note that I will leave you on is where do we go from here, right? We saw last week, Rakdos Prowess, very dominant. We saw this week, people answered to Rakdos Prowess. It still had a couple of good challenges. It's still up there in terms of numbers. Even in the challenge, it's not the most played. It's either the second or third most played, but people are finally starting to respect it. I would expect, going into next week, I think that these numbers are going to go down further because, well, mostly I just think the Rakdos deck is maybe a bit of a scam, but at the end of the day, I'm sure I'm going to get flamed in the comments for that one. But I think that people are going to maybe even try to beat it even more, and we're going to see the numbers of the Rakdos deck slowly dip off until it maybe eventually just kind of craters off before the regional championship. Because I don't expect a ton of this deck in the RC. Maybe I'm crazy, but yeah, so my prediction for next week, well, we'll do this all again in 7 days' time. I expect to see more Jund Sacrifice, more Izzet Phoenix, more Azorius Control. I mean, as far as sleepers are concerned, I really like the creativity decks. I think they're in a pretty good spot right now because they have a good blend of counter spells to fight off the sort of bigger decks or mid-range decks. They have enough cheap removal to fight off the aggro decks. So I think that creativity is maybe poised for a comeback as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me. With all that said, I really hope you guys enjoyed the content. If you have any suggestions for how we can improve on this in the future, please be sure to let me know in the comment section down below. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.